these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
All right, folks, if you listen to this podcast, you've heard the word woke a lot. Follow politics at all. It's a commonly used word. It generally means what it means. I think everybody gets it. It's important though to understand its foundations, how it's infiltrated our society, why the left is so obsessive about it. And so we have a special guest, one of the first conservative leaders who really connected the dots on what goes on behind the scenes with wokeism on the left. We got Chris Rufo with us today. He routinely exposes the cultural decay happening at a lot of our nation's top institutions. He's revealed doctors at children's hospitals bragging about gender mutilation. He's worked with whistleblowers to expose whiteness training for more than 1,000 employees at Walmart. Employees were told the United States is a white supremacy system designed by white Europeans for the purpose of assigning and maintaining white skin access to power and privilege. His long line of investigations into radical gender ideology and critical race theory plaguing our country also revealed so-called anti-racism initiatives at companies like the Bank of America and Google. One program went so far as to encourage employees to be woke at work, whatever that means. In his new book, America's Cultural Revolution, How the Radical Left Conquered Everything, he thoroughly exposes how our institutions were infiltrated by left-wing intellectuals and militants who slowly and methodically captured our country. So today we're going to talk about the moral decay that has led to the re-engineering of our basic norms and see if we can get them back. Chris, thanks for being on. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be with you.
So we'll get into this, into your book. But you've made these documentaries, or are they more like kind of guerrilla journalism? Tell us about like how you got it started in this and what your first, I guess, products were.
Yeah, when I first entered the working world, I worked on feature documentaries. I directed a number for PBS. I sold one to Netflix. Traveled around the world doing, high production documentaries. And then when I could enter my 30s, I used some of those skills to work in politics, doing journalism, analysis, reporting. And so the reporting that I did on critical race theory, that I'm continuing to do on gender ideology, is all original source document reporting. So I have sources and connections and confidants in many institutions around the country. They send me materials, we vet them, we take a look at them, we digest them, and then I do the reporting. And I think the reason that the reporting has been so successful is that, first of all, it's undeniable. I mean, these are source documents. We're catching people doing exactly what they're doing in black and white. And then I'm able to tell a story using some of those storytelling skills that I developed earlier in my career that is, I think, has been persuasive to so many Americans who are, I think, late to the game in figuring out what's happening. But at this point now, 3 years after George Floyd, I think it's now conventional wisdom on the right about what is happening with our institutions. And the key question is now, what do we do about it? And that's the question that we are all participating in and debating.
Yeah, it is. And, we've been having this conversation for many years now. I don't want to say it's getting tired, but it's kind of, because it's a slog. I mean, culture wars are a slog. You identify the problem initially and you get people motivated about the problem, but then you got to affect change on the problem. And that just takes time. It's a grind. Because people have, it's got to be really in somebody's face for them to take action. And, you definitely saw some change in the last couple of years. There's sweeping, this sweeping increase in I would say parents participate. I can't speak right now. Parents' participation in school board meetings, taking the fight to them because they could see very clearly what kind of curriculum was coming down on them. And, change is affected that way. But let's talk history. I think it's interesting to look at the roots of what we deem to be wokeism. Let's define what wokeism is. And let's talk about the cultural roots that it has. I think your book gets into that.
Yeah, that's right. And so what the book does, it tells the story of the left-wing cultural revolution from 1968 to the present. It talks about the original formulation of these ideas in the late 60s and early 70s, and then how these ideas were not just on the radical fringes, but slowly and methodically started gaining entry into key institutions and then really conquering these institutions. And so, for example, even a Walmart, which is a capitalist corporation motivated by profit, is still, at least as a matter of public affirmation, mouthing the words of wokeism. And wokeism is pretty simple. The collection of ideologies that we can trace in fine detail culminate in a pretty simple formula. The United States is inherently a racist, sexist, oppressive nation. Our country preaches the values of freedom and equality, but those are merely a smokescreen for domination. And that in order to get at freedom or liberty or racial equity, we have to abolish all of the institutions that we know and implement a program of radical left-wing revolution. You see it coming about on race, on sex, on policing, in education. But I think that's really the way that really the simple narrative that unites them all.
Yeah, sort of a perpetual victim narrative, I think, and this hierarchy of victims. I think is a key feature of it. A segregation of individuals into group identities. You are a certain way because of your inalienable characteristics. Immutable characteristics, things you can't change about yourself. Your behavior and character and personality. It matters a lot less than the color of your skin, your gender, or whatever the hell gender you say you are, et cetera, et cetera. So like is it morphing, right? Or is it, because what's interesting, what's funny about progressives is they get bored eventually, and they want to push the envelope more. How have you, since you started investigating this, like, is the radicalization got increased, or is it just spread? I mean, increased in ferocity, right? As far as how crazy it is.
Yeah, I think it does. I think that there's a cycle where it begins with idealism. That idealism hits contact with reality, and reality thwarts that idealism. And then it turns into cynicism. So people who are finding their positions within institutions, making sure that they get paid, like the leaders of BLM, for example. And then who are left are really the hardcore, the people, in some cases, the kind of pathological elements of the coalition who haven't got the message that now it's time to just get on a grift. And those are the people that push even further, even deeper, even more kind of bizarre territory. And so I think the main thrust of it, narratively, but also politically, shifted from race. Once that was, yielded negative results in crime and chaos and death in American cities. When defund the police, people started to actually get wise to it. Like, oh, maybe not a good idea to defund the police. Then it's like immediately going into gender and sexuality and trying to push down gender theory down to the lowest levels in education, kindergarten, first grade, second grade. So I think there is this cycle, but conservatives should also be careful, because what happens with the left is they have a wheel that they use. It's race, class, gender. That's been the basic formula for many decades. And so when people are tired of BLM, then they go to kind of transgender activism. And then when perhaps the economy starts to soften, they go back to a more kind of Occupy Wall Street class-based argument. And so they're very skillful at relenting when things are unpopular and then cycling back, because they know that people have spent, 3, 4, 5, maybe 10 years not thinking about that part of the three-part stool, and they bring it back as if it were a fresh idea.
That's an interesting observation. I think it's probably true. They are really skilled. I mean, they're the most skilled, thoughtful activism when it comes to wanting to win, and in a way that the right just refuses to have. A case in point, what we're doing right now in Congress, so this budget, there's an utter refusal to win. The left doesn't make that mistake. You have something interesting that you wrote. You said, today, America's cultural revolution has reached the end game. The descendants of the new left have completed their long march through the institutions, installed their ideas into school curricula, popular media, government policy, corporate human resources, programs, et cetera. So, kind of echoes, I read a Victor Davis Hanson op-ed recently, kind of echoed that same sentiment. Like, more along the angle there, though, is, the left now has to live with its end game, with what it created, which is, it's also an interesting observation to watch them have to live with that. And, the Democrat Dallas mayor turning Republican is sort of a good example of that. But I read what you just wrote here and I'm like, well, maybe that's the good news, actually. Reach the end game. And I agree with it. I don't think I think society, it can't be pushed any further on this. I think there's a backlash that we've seen, again, with you talk about parents going to school board meetings and demanding action and things like that. Should we be at least optimistic then?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should always be optimistic, even when the odds are against us. Just to have a chance at winning, you have to have some baseline of optimism. But I think the end game is really important because there is a tendency on the right, I think largely because of the failure of, let's say, the moral majority style of culture war. That somehow culture war is not worth fighting, that somehow culture war is a sideshow, that somehow cultural issues are something we should just pretend that not to be fighting over in public. But the end game of the left on culture, this is America's cultural revolution. It's not just to revolutionize the culture. And since the beginning of this in the 1960s, they thought that if you soften up the culture, if you take over key cultural institutions, if you start changing how people think, how people speak, how people behave, the manners and morals of society, then you can have the total revolution. That's when you can have economic revolution and ultimately political revolution. In the 1960s, they wanted it to be a Marxist-Leninist style revolution. I don't think that is really in favor on the left, but they certainly want to see, at a bare minimum, a kind of turbocharged Bernie Sanders style takeover of economic institutions, a one-party political rule. They would love to see a kind of New Deal style, multi-decade left-wing dominance, using the bureaucracies to enforce their ideas throughout society. And so I think that the culture war is essential because the culture war is the entry point for some of these greater challenges. And I'd like to see some of our friends that are more kind of Reaganite economic freedom conservatives recognize with many of us who are foregrounding culture that these are two things that are intimately connected, and you actually you will either win on both fronts or eventually you will lose on both fronts.
Yeah, I mean, politics is downstream of culture. The policy is downstream of the politics. So, you've got to win over people's hearts and minds, and then you can win elections, and then you can implement policy. So, yeah, I agree. I disagree a little. I'm not sure I can find Republican politicians that sort of actively dismiss the culture war. They may not be engaged in it on a daily basis. And that is what it is. But I think Republican Party is fairly unified in this. I mean, it's moderate or not moderate. It's easy to get people on my bill for, removing funding to children's hospitals if they do transgender surgery on minors. Like that's a crazy lightning rod issue. I mean, it is, but I don't think there's any Republicans in our conference that would be against it. I haven't found them yet. So, it's
well, that's good to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. It's there, but it's not everybody is skilled at the culture war. Not everybody knows how to talk about it. They're like, it's crazy. It's, that's obvious. A lot of these, and I am defending kind of politicians because a politician's job is policy, right? That's why we have them. We have guys like you for the culture war. Everybody does have their role. And I do notice that activists kind of yell at politicians a lot because they want them to be everything to them. And that's just it's not humanly possible. But we have come a long way. We have come a long way, though.
That's right. And I think that, my own views on politicians are a bit different than some of my colleagues in media and in think tank world. I always try to explain to my friends in think tank world is that ultimately, the politicians have a much more difficult job than we do. They have to fly back and forth with their district. They have to deal with constituents. They have to run an office. They have to deal with the kind of clown show in DC, and they have to manage all of these different constituencies and all of these different issues simultaneously. And so when I've been successful changing policy, with President Trump, with Governor DeSantis and state legislatures across the country on CRT, on gender, I always explain, you have to just bring the political leaders a ready-made solution on a nice platter and present,
You
say,
do.
hey, here's the problem. Here's how to talk about it. Here's the evidence why you can be successful with it.
Yep.
And here's an actual model bill that you can run through the legislature. And at the end of it, you'll be winning and you'll achieve the objectives that you have. And so,
Right.
I always try to defer to political leaders, which is not always popular on our side. But I think that has served at least me quite well.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And until that's a people, whatever the interest is, whatever if somebody has a problem, whatever the constituency is, it's like, yeah, you can't just kind of vaguely describe a problem to me and then expect action. I don't know
Yeah.
how you think this works. You gotta do some work. We're a team.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the movement, the conservative movement, has to view itself as a team where some are fighting a culture war, winning the culture war, which makes it easier to run on those issues, win elections, which makes it easier to then pass policy and gain traction on the policy. Not just introduce bills.
That's right.
Just introducing bills is introducing bills. There's a fair amount of virtue signaling up here, but I mean, really getting a strategy to win. We're as we're talking, I don't know when we're going to post this episode, but for the audience knowing, like, we're literally we just failed to pass the conservative CR. Government shutdown is imminent in the next just over 24 hours. So it's a shit show.
Wow.
And like critical to this debate is how to win, right? Like there's not like a substantive disagreements within the Republican conference regarding this budget, right? It's a serious disagreement on what winning is and what wins are possible and how to actually build a strategy to win. I'm of the opinion that the people who just took down the conservative temporary funding bill have no desire to win. None. Just because it's not clear at all what they think the steps 2, 3, and 4 are. We need to get our shit together as a movement, and put at the forefront. We're going to fight with each other, fight about the best strategy to win, argue it out, and maybe the best argument win, and then you stick together and you use that strategy. There's a lot of I think pretend pretend fighting in the Republican Party that just doesn't happen on the left, right? This constant trying to outdo each other, this rhino hunting obsession. It's absolutely fucking crazy. And it's exhausting, and what it's really doing though is it's making it easier for Democrats to keep winning because it's just such a giant distraction. The only way it stops is if voters stop rewarding it, which ain't happening anytime soon. So anyway,
I also think that the optimistic kind of other side of the coin, though, is that in state legislators that have great governors and have a kind of strong executive leadership, they can tame their legislators. They have more comfortable majorities. Obviously, Republicans in Congress are in the kind of minority, and then which makes it very, very difficult. But I think ultimately it comes down to some leadership, and we need to have executives and political leaders on our side that are calling the plays. Because right now we're like a football team with no quarterback, and I think it's chaotic because everyone is trying to do what they think is best, can't settle on a winning strategy. And then, of course, when we can't settle on a winning strategy, everyone on our side ends up losing. I mean, some people might be able to send out fundraising emails and such, but that's such a cheap consolation prize. And so, yeah, I think you're right. We need to get with it. We need to have good leadership, and I think we need to have a clearly defined mission and clearly defined victory, both in the short term when obviously we have we're in the opposition, but also eventually, optimistically, what does a governing vision look like? And I don't see that. I see some piecemeal kind of issue by issue positions, but I don't think we have the kind of cohesive national agenda that we might have, and that we really should have.
that's true. That's true. I mean, by definition, when your president's not in power, I think by definition there is no leader of the party, and it's a bit of a disadvantage. And there's a lot of and because in a presidential election too, so there's a lot of maneuvering on one another and internal fighting, which is just makes that vision even harder to actually string together. Back to
Yeah.
wokeism. Back to wokeism. This is another observation that's interesting and I think true, which is the left maintains control through the maintenance of myths, beliefs, and incentives rather than a central leadership or direction. Yeah, and I think that's true, and it's like impressive too, because it is like they've sort of created this religion where everybody sort of reads off the same sheet of music, but you're like, where do I actually find that sheet of music? And it's unclear, you know. I say the same thing about like our kind of QAnon right too, because I'm like they always say the same things, and I'm like, where are you reading this? Like where you're saying the exact same things, but where is your like document? It's odd. That's sort of how like the strange religious movements and cults kind of I guess build up, but the left has just done such a fantastic job normalizing it. And
Yeah.
like these kind of radical leftists, they talk the same. It's like it's a language. Like how does it happen?
Yeah. And the big difference is, you know, while the QAnon right is organizing on obscure message boards and coordinating their messages in a mimetic and decentralized way, the
Yeah.
left is doing the same thing with all of our schools, all of our bureaucracies, all of our big company HR departments, all of our philanthropic institutions. I mean, the scale that it happens on is really amazing, and that's really the reason that I wrote the book, was to find out the roots of these ideas, these phrases, these slogans, to say, as you said, where is the sheet music that all these people are singing from? And so, you know, the answer is that all of these ideas and even some of the exact phrasing that you hear was all developed wholesale by 1968, 1969. I mean, all of it. You know, if you think about what Ibram Kendi says, none of it is new.
Mhm.
It's all repeating what Herbert Marcuse was saying, what Angela Davis was saying, what Eldridge Cleaver was saying, what the Black Panther Party pamphleteers were writing. These are all old ideas resurrected, softened a bit. You know, they're not, you know, bombing the U.S. Capitol or throwing hand grenades in the NYPD offices, but they've taken the basic ideology and they've made it palatable for K through 12 teachers, for
Mm.
corporate DEI trainers, for, you know, bureaucrats in our Federal Reserve, for example. I did some reporting there. And so it is amazing, and it's maintained not by some shadowy conspiracy. Anytime you hear conservatives talking about, it's like, no, that's not what's happening here. Um, it's because these ideas have dominated in academia. They've gained popularity through kind of media entities, and then they figured out very brilliantly all of the transmission mechanisms, like K through 12 teacher training programs in state universities are generally the most left-wing parts of our public university system, even in red states. And so when they say, "Well, how did we get all these woke teachers in Oklahoma?" Well, have you looked at University of Oklahoma's teacher training school? No. Well, guess what? Your legislators have been not paying attention, and consequently, you've lost your institutions not just in San Francisco and Seattle and New York City. Great, criticize those, but look actually at what's happening in Idaho and Oklahoma and Tennessee and other red, you know, presumably red states. The
Yeah.
institutions have been captured. And then what you have is you have conservative grassroots activists and parents and good people trying to fight back, but they're fighting against people who have a full-time public subsidy to do left-wing activism. That's a very difficult problem to solve.
It is, and you know, it takes. There's always somebody in charge, whatever situation it is, whether it's a curriculum at a school or a company. There's always somebody in charge who can't stop it. And one question we should be asking ourselves is, you know, are we being strategic? Because I think about it always from like a military targeting perspective. I guess it's like, all right, who's in charge? Who's in charge of what? Who's the middlemen, the top guys? Who's the HVIs? And how do we target them? How do you influence them? And the answer is always like it's hard, but it's also, I'm not even sure anybody's really trying either. I don't know if there was a question in there or not, but it was an observation, I guess. Another observation I had, maybe you could comment on, is like you said, it's not so much like they don't really identify as Marxists now. I think you could describe it as being related to Marxism, of course, but back in the 60s, it certainly was related to like identified as Marxism. How much did you research the Russian influence into that? You know, this is the height of the Cold War. The Soviets were doing active propaganda. I mean, it's all documented at this point. most of their investments were into making America hate itself. And I tell people, because there's a strange undercurrent on the American right now where they're not sure why Russia's the enemy. And I say, do you hate wokeism? Because Russia created that for you. Did you get into that at all?
Yeah, and in one particular case, I devote a whole section of the book to Angela Davis. Angela Davis was the Black Marxist-Leninist radical Communist Party USA member. She provided the weapons that ended up in a courthouse siege in Marin County that left a judge and a number of other innocent people dead. And after she was acquitted, the jury, said we're with Angela's revolution, and so we acquit her because she's a political prisoner. Where did she go? She went on a victory tour through the Soviet Union and the Soviet socialist republics. And so they used her as a propaganda symbol. They hosted her tour. They had hundreds of thousands of people waving the flags. They mimicked back to the United States those left-wing talking points. Although I would say, I think that the confusion, or rather the disagreement now, is because the Soviet Union is dead. It's finished. The ideology of international communism was kind of thought to be buried many years ago. And I think that actually is a big problem for the right, because the great anti-communist right in the United States in the kind of 20th century, once the foe was vanquished in the early 1990s, kind of said, all right, we've done our job. We had the 100-year war against communism. We've won. Now we're going to get back to business. We're going to go back to private life. We're going to retreat to our religious institutions. What they didn't realize, though, is that the left-wing ideology that was the beating heart of this movement in the West was still alive and well within our institutions. And so I think that if you look at it now, actually we're in a paradoxical position where American institutions are actually, more left-wing, more Gramscian, more, even Leninist in their orientation. Than just about anywhere in let's say the Western world, with some exceptions maybe in Western Europe. But we have a very left-wing culture, paradoxically, after we defeated the great global empire of left-wing communism.
Oh no, the Soviets who designed those propaganda techniques I don't think could have ever imagined how successful their propaganda would be. And it's frightening. And the institutions of communism were defeated, but the tactics used by Russians have not been defeated. Vladimir Putin is, of course, a KGB. He's a Soviet KGB agent. That's his background. He hasn't changed. They've changed the way they do information operations against the West, but he hasn't changed. And so it's just so people know, like that's where a lot of this stuff comes from. A lot of Soviet defectors bragged about it, or told us about it, bragged about it, however you want to say it. It was.
I think they also, though, it's not that their propaganda was successful. I mean, of course, it was in many regards. They had agents in the United States, starting in the 1930s and going all throughout the 20th century, but they were exploiting an inherent vulnerability within our own society. And so even after the collapse of global communism, it continued in our own society, not because of an external influence operation, but because there is a real soft spot in our own culture for these ideas. And so I think that we have to look at it now in the context of this is an internal problem with no easy external enemy to kind of project onto. And so
now it is. Yeah, I agree with that.
It is. Yeah.
Now it's not defeated. Yeah. Sorry.
But now it makes it much scarier because we have now a country that is split on these cultural issues, for example, that are and governing issues. I mean, the kind of governing regime that we want, the kind of basic political structure that is going sideways. And I think that in a real sense, having an external enemy in the 20th century was made it easier because you could at least draw a distinction abroad. Whereas now these distinctions are playing out in a way that I think is much more anxiety-inducing for most people. I mean, most Americans don't want to participate in these culture wars. Most Americans want to do what they want to do. They want to go to go to work, take care of their kids, have a good education, provide for their families. But unfortunately, we have to settle some of these big cultural questions, and I don't think that we've figured out how to negotiate the terms very effectively in recent years.
Also, what's your opinion on like the actual state of the problem? This is a really tough question, but it's worth kind of diving into. Um, because social media puts every single problem around the world in front of your face simultaneously. It's making people insane. It's the human brain. Somebody said this recently. I have to give whoever I stole it from credit like a couple times, and then I'm just going to say it was my own thought. But only God can has the emotional capacity to deal with omniscience. You do not have the emotional capacity to deal with omniscience, and yet the internet and social media has given you something that is quite close to it, where you see all the crazy and all the world's problems. And if you really start getting obsessed over it, you see more and more and more and more, and it's just right there at your fingertips. And you can work yourself into an absolute frenzy. And I, as a politician, see people who have worked themselves into an absolute frenzy quite often. And they're like, they truly think like we're in end times, the left and right. Like this is for different reasons, right? The left thinks the end times are because of climate change, and the right thinks the end times are because of wokeism. And I'm like, I don't really, the left is, I don't really, I don't really deal with the left. So but I want to talk to my constituents on the right. I'm like, you need to take a break from social media for 30 minutes or for 30 days.
Yeah, it's a new technology, and a technology that creates an instant exchange of mimetic images that can be very powerful in building, good salutary political movements. The movement, that I was kind of helped launch against critical race theory in schools, was greatly aided and probably would have been impossible without social media. And then of course, broadcast media, Fox and other outlets. So we were able to successfully fight against these large institutions that had, the permanent bureaucracy behind them, using social media in a way that was effective, salutary, healthy, and good. But of course, every technology can also be used for ill. So you have people going into kind of racialism, into conspiracy theories, into just kind of outrage for outrage's sake, a kind of a cycle of outrage that leads nowhere. So it can be also very destructive. And so I think that it's how we discipline ourselves. It's how we discipline our own coalition. It's how we have public arguments about social media itself. But I think it's here to stay. And I think that I know that I use it, and of course, sometimes it makes you anxious or infuriated or upset. But I think that in the best possible iteration of how we use this technology is that actually our institutions would be more receptive to democratic limitation, to democratic guidance, to democratic opinion. And for conservatives, I think that the great lesson of the book is that conservatives are on the outside of every major institution right now, in a very real sense. I've talked to even some of your colleagues who shall remain nameless, but they say, hey, look, I couldn't go get a job at my old law firm, after my political gig is up because I'm a conservative Republican. And so we need any kind of tool that we can use that gives us an asymmetrical advantage over very powerful, permanent bureaucratic institutions. I think social media is one of them. We have to limit the damage on the kind of negative side of it, but ultimately, I think it can be used as a force for good.
I agree with that. I think I guess I didn't really finish my thought. I guess my point was sometimes people can believe it's all around them when it's actually still a problem that's defeatable. There's and I encourage people to just take a freaking breath sometimes. Also, if you're just if you're in a frenzy, like you're honestly, you're not helpful to the fight. So keep your emotions down. And yeah, it's a problem. It's worse in some areas than in other areas, but like there's always a couple sides to a story. For every woke crap you hear coming out of an HR from a corporation, you do have to take into account that like still 90% of the people at that company, if you just go talk to them like human beings, are like, I don't really know what that's about. Like they're not indoctrinated. They're not on your side. They're not mad about it either. Like they're not on your side, but they're also not indoctrinated. There's a lot more regular people out there than you realize. And it's important to remind our own activists of that, because it can just, social media puts it in front of your face in a way that I think it could make it seem unrealistically, the problem make it seem unrealistically larger than it is. And that's just counterproductive for trying to defeat it, I think. Well, last question, I know you got to go. What's the new College of Florida? You were just pointed on the board to that. Can you tell us about that real quick, and then we'll wrap it up?
Yeah, it's a really exciting initiative. At the beginning of the year, Governor DeSantis announced this really bold policy idea. He like many other conservatives understood that the universities are essential to our governance, to our public life, to our shaping of good citizens. Public universities in Florida, like elsewhere, have been captured by left-wing activists who use their public position to advance their private ideological interests. And so he announced a new board of trustees, including me, to take over Florida's smallest public university, which was a notorious kind of left-wing social justice campus, to take it over, to take out, to kind of fire the leadership, to bring in good new people, and to transform it into an institute of classical liberal arts education that was oriented towards the true, the good, and the beautiful, that had a wide variety of perspectives on campus, including rebalancing towards having some conservative views on campus, and then providing a campus where conservative families in the state of Florida could be excited and happy to send their kids. And so it's an example of institutional recapture, reforming, revitalizing these institutions. And so, of course, the left was not happy about this. It's been the subject of an infinite number of left-wing attacks. But the bottom line is this: it was the lowest performing public university in the state, and in just a few months, we brought in a new president, a new provost. We abolished the DEI department. We're moving to abolish the gender studies program. We recruited the largest incoming class in the college's history. We have the school on the best financial footing that it's ever been since it was established in 1960, and we are building this campus, brick by brick. And I think in the coming weeks and months, we'll be announcing some great new professors, including many professors from elite institutions, Ivy League schools, top 10 universities around the country, who are sick of the censorship, the bullying, the intimidation. They want a free place to teach, to work. That's what we're trying to build at New College. And I think, despite all of the attacks, we're going to be successful.
Where is it in Florida?
It's in Sarasota, Florida. The campus is beautiful. It's right on the beach. Nice. The kind of marquee buildings are the old Ringling Brothers mansions that were, donated to the college. And it's a beautiful place. And the tuition is, less than $7,000 a year for Florida residents. So it's also a really affordable education.
That's great to hear. Love it. Hey, Chris, thanks so much for being on. Thanks for fighting the fight.
Thank you. And keep up your patience and your hard work through these budget problems. I know we'll get there eventually.
Patience is not a virtue I exercise very well, but I'm doing my best. All right.
Working on it.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, Dan.
See ya.
Bye-bye.